Right. Perfect. Recording now. Right. Today, or this evening, I'm just going to give you probably a lot of information, so which is one of the reasons why I'm going to record it. I will also give you a copy of the presentation, and I've created a sheet of around 32 common data analysis that you can do around particular areas of the procurement process. So there's a lot of information within this presentation. So you may wish to revisit the recording once you receive it, just to go over it. I'm going to just briefly touch on the procurement process, only for a couple of seconds, just to let you know where the key areas are to look. I'm going to just briefly touch on common data sources that should be considered as part of the the proactive investigation of data and data analysis, and just go into key examples. And if I've got time, talk about a number of case studies that will, just to add weight to the types of data analysis. So here we go. Let's see. Again, I think I've talked about this before. These are just the key typologies of procurement fraud and corruption. And there are 5 key elements. From left to right, you've got your completely insider corruption, where an individual or individuals within an organization will look to either steal assets or defraud the organization by creating fictitious companies. You've got the fraud and corruption between an individual and an insider and a supplier. You've got the collusion, between companies to manipulate the competition process and ultimately inflate the bottom price, the price of the contract. And I'm going to touch on that in the next hour as well. You've got the individual company fraud, and there are many examples of that. And on the far right, which we're really not going to touch on today, which is your organizations that are targeted by organized crime, which can include email compromise to ultimately try and divert future funds. I'll just ask that you mute your screens, please. Right. So just to touch on the procurement process, again, I'm not going to go into any detail, but just to give examples of it, these are sort of 12 areas that need to be considered. You may not necessarily get data from these areas, but certainly these are key areas where fraud might occur, or corruption, as you say, certainly on this point might occur. And it's worth considering, particularly where you have particular risks within an organization, particularly projects. Again, it's a number of areas to consider. In the post-award side, particularly in projects, again, there are again another example of 10 areas that should be considered. Variations, particularly, and I'm going to talk about key examples of ad hoc and emergency work variations. Work sign-off, particularly where there's a corruption risk from project managers or civil engineers. Asset management, I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of asset management, because it's something particularly on projects where we may consider looking at the tender process and looking at risks in the onboarding of suppliers, but we're not actually looking at the assets that are being procured, and you may have sort of high volume thefts, particularly in projects where assets aren't particularly tracked that well and there isn't proper warehousing, etc. So just to touch on data sources then, there are many examples of data sources, and certainly procurement and finance are 2 examples, but there are many examples that should be considered. And certainly areas such as, in the top right, you've got maintenance and quality assurance and equipment failure. There are many examples, and many organizations, or if not most organizations, don't look at that from a fraud perspective. where you have equipment failures, particularly regularly in a particular area, do you have either a fraud going on where there's actually a false requirement, or do you have things like product substitution or counterfeit products in a particular area where equipment is continually failing? And particularly in organizations where they have a central capability, do you have access to all that data? For instance, in human resources department may keep expenses data, staff data. Do you have access to that data, or do human resources like to keep a tight hold of it, particularly where you're comparing staff information with suppliers to look at conflicts of interest? Do you have access to that area, or is it an area of risk that you're actually missing? Now, I'm not going to go into particular detail, but these are just some key examples. And here are, again, from those, some of the key areas that you may want to consider for data analysis. And again, I'm not going to go into detail. These are just for your example, which I'll provide you at the end of the presentation. But I'm certainly going to talk about one or two as I go through. Now, this is the 7 C, what I call the 7 C's of risk review. And it's a method that I've put together where you have, for instance, a data analysis where you have a large number of results, or even just one result for that matter. It's always good to have particularly where you have false positives. You may have a red flag or an indicator, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's fraud there. So it's good to have a simple method of looking at the risk to see whether there's fraud or whether you can actually eliminate it. That it's a legitimate red flag. Something like not necessarily double billing, where you have duplicate entries. There may be a particular reason for that. And just going round from top right in conflicts of interest, again, where you have a particular risk, do you marry information in relation to conflicts of interest from supplier, supplier data, do a look at executives as an example and compare that against staff and information, individuals who are involved in the contract, or depending on the risk, do you compare the supplier, the new vendor data with your current suppliers to see whether there's a duplicate? So just a simple approach. Where there's a particular methodology, do you look at, for instance, contracts, do you look at whether there's a similar methodology on previous contracts or other contracts that the company are currently involved with? Again, costs and charges could be you're invoicing, whether if there's a particular methodology used, as inflating invoices as an example, is this a common theme by a supplier, or is it just the first time they've done it or the first time caught, or does it historically go back quite a way? I think, and company formation, looking at the company registration, when was a company formed, is always a good indicator. I've seen it on more than one occasion where a company received a contract and they were only formed the week before they were awarded the contract. So company formation data is always valuable because it also gives you, looking at the financials of the company, it looks at the directors and board of the company. Again, that may link you back to conflicts of interest. And then there's obviously communication. What are your internal communication sources, particularly emails and telephone data? Is there a risk? Is there a link between that supplier and someone within an organization? And also looking at capability, particularly where there's a risk. Do you want to look at a supplier visit? Do you want to look at the capability of a supplier that hasn't been checked previously, where they say they have a capability of 50 staff, but when you go and check at the location, it's actually just a small outfit above a shop. So it's worth looking at. And again, compliance at the top, just to look at where there's particularly non-compliance by individuals, whether a public servant or a supplier, where there's non-compliance with procurement policy or ethics policies or gifts and hospitality, is that another indicator that can add to the overall picture of risk when you look at particular, we have a red flag that comes up to you. So this is just something that I always do as a, if like a quick assessment of whether there is a risk and whether that needs to go to a much fuller investigation or audit of the contract itself. So with this one here, I'm not going to go into particular detail. This is just for your own information, really. And it's just to show the key elements of within a project structure of individuals that can influence a project. From the project management side, on the right, from the different roles that might be involved in the project. And in addition to the various types of procurement fraud and corruption that can go on, there are certainly for me, there are four key elements that are constant, are the basics to look for in projects is quality, quantities, resources, and time. There are so many methods in which a contractor can manipulate a project in these particular areas. Time particularly, it could be something as simple as, from a corruption perspective, is delaying a project that are not moving the end date. So it means that the contractor has to add additional resources into the project, which will ultimately increase or potentially increase the cost. Again, quality in inferior products, again, is a particular method where certainly I've been told by a project manager before that a company, in particular where there's a lot of competition, will look to put in a really low quote where there will only be sort of 2% profit for the company. So they will look throughout the lifetime of the project on how to maximize their profit within the project. So that the price that is set at the start won't necessarily be the total cost at the end of a project. So again, introducing quality issues, inferior products or product substitution, the common resources, and I'll touch on that later as well, is that where resources aren't monitored within a project, then it's very easy to manipulate a project. Certainly one oil and gas company I talked to, one of the major projects they're involved in, and one of the major contracts was around security because it was in Nigeria, and there was various layers of security around the premises, around individuals, around vehicles and individuals in transit, and this contract was worth hundreds of millions every year. But what didn't happen in the project or in the contract, there wasn't an audit carried out for a number of years. And when they eventually carried out an audit, they identified that around 25% of the contract wasn't being provided. So they were billing for 100% of the staff, but they were only providing 75% of the staff. And the fraud went into the hundreds of millions due to the value of the contract. So again, unless there's oversight and audit, it's unlikely that these types of fraud will be identified. So I'm just going to touch on a number of areas from an insider threat perspective, and the corruption perspective. There are certainly many areas in which they can influence a contract, particularly at the pre-award stage, and things like biased or broad specification is a simple one to introduce, particularly where there's been early disclosure to a supplier that they want to win the contract. Having a broad specification, and I've been certainly involved in it myself, where you have a broad specification, it's difficult for a vendor to then put in an accurate technical specification to a contract. And also, it's, again, even more difficult to put a cost to that from the commercial perspective as well. Again, short deadlines for bid submissions. This is one to sort of look at, particularly where, not only to look at the short deadlines, but also where you can have data analysis on the number of bidders that actually respond. So where you have only one bidder respond, is there a significant risk from corruption, or for that matter, from the collusion between companies? It's certainly one of the indicators. Certainly when I looked at, I made a comparison between UK procurement, government procurement, and the number of individual single returns was, and contracts where there was only 2 returns. In the single returns, there was around 3.5% of national contracts where only 1 vendor returned, and with 2 vendors returned, it was around 7.5%. So, you know, a percentage may be legitimate, but you know, how much of that percentage, which obviously goes into the tens of thousands of contracts, how many of those were actually down to fraud and corruption? So certainly looking at, you know, if you're able to do it, to look at the overall picture or the annual picture of where you have single returns. Is there a pattern? Is there particular companies that are awarded in competition where only 1 vendor responds? It's certainly one to look at. Again, where contracts are not advertised, or companies are not, you know, deliberately not invited to tender. I certainly had one example where on a medical services contract, the current vendor wasn't invited to tender for the contract, and wasn't aware of it. When the individual who put out the new contract was asked, I was informed that the company had a bad reputation and there was a lot of complaints made. But when I asked about the complaints and who these individuals were to follow up with it, they couldn't provide any information. So there was an attempt to manipulate the award of the contract. Again, quick or late submissions, quick submissions. Did they, you know, where there's a response within a day, you know, particularly where it's a large contract that would require a lot of information and work on the contract. Is there, yeah, if it's quick, is it an indication that the company was aware of it? And if there's late submissions, were they allowed after the deadlines? Particularly worrying is where, you know, the bids would have been opened. I've certainly had it myself where we have emailed our submission into the organisation, and we were informed at the closing date that the bidding process was delayed by another week. Now that gives an individual an opportunity to share the technical and pricing information with the vendor they want. So there's obviously a risk there. Again, few returns, which I've talked about. Again, pricing and estimates. Again, have you got your own pricing estimates, and what's submitted are they comparable? Are they something similar? Clarifications not shared. And this is where communications might come into play, where a company asks a question about the particular tender, and that reply isn't shared with any of the other bidding companies. Is that something that could be verified? Again, mobilization too quick, which I talked about. On the specification of the service not provided, vendor unable to or unqualified to provide the specification. So is the contractor bidding on work that he hasn't got the specification or capability to provide? Again, apologies if I'm rushing through these. There is within this sort of hour, there is a lot of information to provide. Again, from the single source perspective, there are many methods of potential fraud. Again, copy and pasting of justifications of particularly in volume procurement. And I've certainly seen it where, particularly in contract files, as an example, on vehicle rentals, on national procurement, which is an ongoing over a number of sites, where because the vehicles weren't being tracked and the procurement wasn't being tracked correctly, it allowed individuals within the organizations to procure vehicles for their own personal use. And simply what they did was they copied emails from different contracts into a contract file to, although the procurement was made, ultimately the request for the procurement and other support and documentation was from other purchase orders, if you like, and then put into a contract file. So again, looking at the contracts themselves to see whether information is relevant to the contract itself. Inaccurate or poorly written justifications, again, maybe an indicator, not necessarily correct. It just depends on, if like the approvals process, whether the procurement manager is prepared to accept badly written justifications. So having accurate justifications, or if there's no justifications or poorly written justification, is it a way to hide a fraud within the background, and was the work ever even carried out? Activity part numbers are service specified. Again, is the requisition being directed towards a particular type of company who can only provide that type of service of that part? Again, no single source justification form. Advance payments are only used for specific suppliers. Are the goods worked to service provided at all? This comes in sort of two parts. I mean, I don't know whether you have such a thing as advance payments in Madagascar, but certainly it's not an uncommon thing. And it's a way, certainly, I've certainly seen it on more than one occasion, where advance payments are used to hide the break payment. Advance payments also from 50 to 100% should really only be used in urgent situations, or where you have a strong relationship with a supplier. However, I've certainly seen it where an individual, or where advance payments are regularly used and there's no particular justification for using it, where the advance payment is used to hide a break payment internally. And what was done was the goods or services may or may not have been provided. There was certainly, on one occasion, the individual approached a vendor and said, "There's a piece of work, and if you give me a kickback, you'll receive the work." Now, basically, the way they used it within the organization was, rather than the supplier paying a kickback through his own accounts, the advance payment method was used via the finance department. So basically, the bank accounts, or the company bank accounts, were changed to personal accounts. A payment was made, and then the accounts were changed back to the company account details. And the simple way we identified this issue is because we actually looked at the advance payments over a 6-month period, and there should have been one or two potentially change of bank account details. There was actually hundreds, and there was not necessarily organized crime, but there was certainly organized criminality in there, in which they were making payments, or creating false requirements and making payments to their own personal bank accounts in various forms. So there's certainly one to look at, and a simple method of looking for not necessarily fraud, not necessarily fraud within the financial department, but certainly where a finance department is really busy and hasn't got time to check change of bank account applications, or doesn't do it correctly. It opens a gap in the system to manipulate the payment system. Sorry. In catalogue material utilization is very poor, and also looking at things like catalogue spend. Or I'll talk about further, is the non-catalogue spend as well, where that has been, catalogue material spend has been done correctly, or you have non-catalogue spend where, generally speaking, an organization will have where it isn't materials or goods aren't within the catalogue, they will say it's cost plus 10%. Is a common theme. However, this would reduce as the value of the procurement rises. So at a low value, it will maybe cost plus 10%, but at a high value, it may be cost plus 1% or below. Now, where you have cost plus 10% at a high value, there may be a fraud or corruption in there, or maybe it's just simple bad financial efficiency. Again, the supplier hasn't carried out this type of work before. Now, this can be looked at in a couple of ways. One, can you look at category management? Do you have that facility in your organization to look at the type of organization and whether, or the suppliers that you have and the categories that you should be working within, and are they working without their category? Or particularly around, certainly one I've seen more than once, is where at the end of the financial year, and I think in the UK it's the end of April, public sector budgets have to get spent, and it's not unusual for organizations to go out, say, we've got this money, how are we going to spend it? And in some respects, a lot of it's wasted. It's not gone on it's not been properly managed. So they'll go out to spend these monies. And certainly one occasion that I was involved with, an individual within an organization built up a corrupt relationship with a supplier. And they basically had nothing to do with the items that were procured. They went out and procured items. I think it was around £300,000 worth of items that they procured. But they basically went out to other suppliers and bought them and put on their profit, and then sold it back to the organization. Now, within that, the public sector individual received a kickback because he was into sports cars, and they basically sponsored his hobby. So so again, one to be aware of for the risk area, and again, what's being procured from the vendor, and do they have the capability, not necessarily capability, but is it part of their category spend? Again, the product or service hasn't been single sourced before. Again, overcharging. Some of these, I suppose, are obvious. Product prices don't match the contract. Increased headcount than what is present. And this can be certainly where, and this is particularly in the public sector, it may be useful in any sort of methodology where when we work with the US authorities, we shared information, not necessarily where we had, for instance, UK companies working on American contracts and vice versa. Because we had a strong relationship, we would share the methodology. If we were investigating a particular type of fraud methodology, we would share that with our counterpart, where we knew the UK company was working on an American contract, just to see whether the company was using that particular methodology. And it's not uncommon. And certainly one occasion, the company on large infrastructure projects was billing for, certainly one project we were working on was the program of works required 10 project managers, or a project team certainly, and they actually only provided three project managers, but were billing for 10, and those three were actually working on different projects as well, so they're actually double billing as well. So sharing of information, and particularly looking at headcount, there's various methods in which this can be done. Again, resources building on multiple projects, packages of works similar or commingled. Again, no supporting paperwork for requisitions of purchase orders or invoices. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a fraud there. It could just be inefficiency within the organization. But I've certainly had it when we reviewed one bank, and this was a common practice where the finance department was the only control within the organization to stop the potential fraud, where they received invoices, but that may not have a purchase order on it, and they had to go back to the originator to find out if the work was conducted at all, and was there a requisition of purchase order. So making sure that these requisition, purchase order, and invoice are married up was certainly a simple method of detecting fraud risk. Again, the schedule of rates and blank purchase order agreements, certainly one to look at, and it's a simple one to suppliers will test the system. It's not uncommon for them to put in invoices with inflated rates, just to see whether it's picked up, and if it's not picked up, then they'll carry on. So certainly where one is picked up, you may not be able to prove the fraud, but you will be able to recover certainly the monies from the amount they've overbilled. Again, is a work paid for within the existing contract? So has additional work been created, or purchase orders been created, when in actual fact it's actually already covered under contract? And this is made certainly simpler where there's an insider threat as well. Again, materials over or under specified that is required, and this certainly when we're talking about the where there is in the project design phase, where the design is and the specification isn't done correctly, where materials have been under specified for the build, as an example, that will allow the winning contract, who's aware of this, to actually inflate the cost during the lifetime of the project, because there will have to be contract amendments because of it. Again, vague line descriptions, including variations of rates month to month. Again, such things will allow, because of the vagueness of it, may allow for contractors to amend contract pricing, or amend contract pricing. And just a few more on certainly on timesheets. Certainly, particularly when we're looking at contractors that are not providing the number of staff they say they are for projects. One simple method to verify this is to, particularly where you have a supplier visit, ask for the timesheets, particularly where they should be filled in daily or weekly. It should be very simple for them to provide it. So if there's only one signature on a timesheet for multiple staff, are they creating a fictitious requirement? Are the fictitious individuals involved within the supplier? Again, timesheets are clocking in cards are controlled by one individual. Certainly, it's not uncommon, particularly where vendors or suppliers have to clock on when on a project site, is for an individual to hold many and to actually clock in individuals that are not there. So certainly introducing a monitoring system, a simple monitoring system there, will identify that. Again, timesheets are illegible or incomplete. Again, maybe an indicator. Missing timesheets. Invoices for services are vague. Consultants working 10 hours, an example. This can also not only be a fraud, but it actually could relate to a corruption as well, where fictitious requirements being created. So there's a consultancy service being created, land information about the work when in actual fact it was never carried out, and the contractor, which may be a personal account, the money's paid into that account. So that's something to look out for. Again, when you're certainly being proactive and looking at this, our contract management staff at ACFE are able to produce timesheets. And again, where you put proactive detection techniques in, such as CCTV, are things that is destroyed or damaged for the contractor to avoid detection. And again, are you unable to identify certain workers in the timesheets? So I'll just quickly run through these. I think they'll be common to you. And again, I produced a sheet on a lot of these detection techniques anyway. Again, duplicate invoices. Again, is it deliberate, or is it a mistake? Is this a common theme of committing the fraud. Same or similar amounts. Again, is there a fraud there? But also, particularly when we're looking at an insider threat, where you have a tender threshold of, say, it's $20,000 or $30,000. Do you see multiple invoices just below that threshold? So it is, it could be simply that the work, individuals, or it becomes common practice that individuals don't want to go through the tender process, so they cut the contract into 2 or 3 to avoid it. Sorry, can you mute your speaker? Thank you. Again, same or similar amounts related to the vendor. Is this a common technique? Certainly on one contract that was involved with a new contractor was awarded 10 low-value contracts of $20,000. So total amounted to $200,000 for different pieces of work. So again, if you have that, different pieces of work, the value should not be the same. Okay. Sorry. Where you have different pieces of work for the same value for the same contractor, it may be an indicator of fraud, because 10 pieces of work shouldn't be the same value. And they basically use the system where because of the nature of the infrastructure project, they actually use cash on low value contracts up to the value of $20,000. And they basically used this method to facilitate the fraud, because what the $200,000 did was allowed the company who had only been set up the week before to actually recruit staff and actually get involved in the infrastructure project. Whereas if the basic due diligence had been carried out, as in looking at the company formation and looking at who the directors and shareholders were, they would have realized it was a significant fraud that was being carried out. Again, same or similar goods or services of the same values. And again, goods and services, should they be the same values? Probably not. Again, just key examples here. I won't go into particular detail. If there is duplicate information, do we want to have a further look? So ad hoc and emergency work, again, works that are not planned and are facilitated through change orders. Again, emergency works, again, very similar, but again, should only be required in an emergency situation. Ad hoc works, again, it shouldn't be a regular thing. So from there may be common indicators. Again, there may be a fault with a product or maintenance regime. So where you have this type of work going on, is there, particularly we're looking at, if like patterns, is there particular work in a regular work in the same area? It might indicate, again, faulty product substitution, counterfeit products, or it may indicate a fictitious requirement. So where you have, particularly maintenance records, can we look at that? Or if we're being proactive and we're aware of this threat, where a new maintenance requirement comes in, can we actually proactively on site have a look at it? Again, isn't the product not fit for purpose? Again, substandard product. Again, and has been a fictitious requirement created. And there's been a lack of a planning of poorly written organization specification. Same area. Again, unusual time of works or late delivery. Again, I've certainly seen it regularly, where companies will look to, particularly where there's increased rates, as an example, as in weekend working, or nighttime working, where there's no supervision of that. A simple fraud, I've actually seen it locally in contracts where we see individuals who turn up for the work but sit in their vehicles all day and do no work because they are claiming double time for that an increased rate, which is ultimately passed on to their employer, which is ultimately passed on to the public sector organisation. So again, have you got the facility to actually monitor this type of work? And is there a pattern? Is it a common theme of weekend work? And is there any justification for it at all? Again, out of contract or non-contract variations. Again, maintenance and medicine we talked about, not fit for purpose, product substitution, false and fictitious work, and high call-out rates. Again, certainly one to look at. Where there are high call-out rates, is there a common theme in being called out, particularly at the weekend? Again, inspection records. Is it something that's are in place? And if it's missing, is there or falsified? If it's missing particularly, is there a risk? Consultancy contracts. Not an uncommon theme, certainly in the larger consultancies, where they will turn up to, particularly in the tender process, they will send their significant consultants to the briefing, to any presentations they have to do. But actually, when it comes to the work itself, they provide a much inferior or substituted lower paid employee, but billing at the higher rate. Again, ghost employees, same principle as the projects. Do these individuals exist, particularly where there are a number of consultants involved in the contract? If they're not properly monitored, can there be false employees introduced? Again, falsification of CVs, particularly in the tendering process. Use of agents or local partners. Certainly this is one, when we're talking about bribery risk, this is maybe one that's created around agents for payment of the kickback. Again, where consultants are used, particularly where there's a shortage of staff, and consultants are used around the procurement process, or particularly around the technical evaluation of proposals. Do the individuals concerned have a link to the bidding companies? So are things like the basic conflict of interest and due diligence carried out on the consultants? Again, protracted period of technical assessment may be an indicator that time has been taken to award a contract to a particular consultant or particular contractor where a consultant is involved in technical assessment. And firms who win are new to the sector and have offered far the lowest price. Maybe an indicator of fraud. It may also be an indicator of, and I'll talk about it in a minute, is bid rigging, because one of the things with bid rigging and collusion between companies is that they will always look to inflate the price of a contract because they'll want to share a level of fraud with all the other bidding companies. So where a new contractor comes in, particularly where there is regular procurement or projects, the price, the usual price that would be expected may drop because there's a new contractor in place. And missing contract or lack of inadequate supporting documents for purchase. Again, this is, for me, certainly, this may be an indicator of fraud, particularly where there's a pattern where electronic data and hard copy data are missing. It may be a method in which individuals are looking to hide the fraud with your insider threat. So just to touch on bid rigging, it's inconsistent globally. The UK had back around 2010 identified significant bid rigging in construction contracts. Around 100 contractors were fined in the UK, but they haven't done very much since then. And certainly the US authorities, the FBI, have introduced the Procurement Collusion Strike Force, and they have identified significant collusion, contractor collusion in government contracts. And just to briefly touch on methodology, certainly behind the scenes, the contractors will they will firstly agree who's going to win the contract first of all, and if there's an opportunity for subcontracting, who that company will be as well. They will also agree, like I said, the price of the contract. So where you have, as an example, 7 companies involved in it, the lowest bid will still be much higher than the price should be. Just the rest will use various methodologies to rule themselves out of the tender process. One of the common themes here, and it's certainly one to be aware of, where you suspect or proactively want to look for bid rigging. If I'm not going to, particularly if you're regularly involved in submitting bids as part of the bid rigging scheme, and if you're not going to win the bid, you would want the contractor who's going to win the bid to share his information so you can create your own bid. So you're creating as little work as possible for yourself. But what happens here, when they do that, they may share particular types of wording, particular mistakes, particular pricing information. You may find, for instance, that companies are using the same suppliers or duplicate information, same addresses or contact information. So where there's data sharing, there may be mistakes. So where you compare particular bids from suppliers, it's certainly one to look at, just to look for errors and duplicates. And then you have the methodology of certainly bid suppression, where certain companies will be told not to bid. So you may go out to tender and you invite, say, 7 companies to bid on a particular contract, and 2 or 3 don't respond. It still looks like competition, but in actual fact, they've deliberately not responded, or one has responded and then withdrawn their bid. So again, it looks like competition. And then you have things like complementary bids, where vendors will provide a bid that's too high, or they may have additional terms within there, such as you might require 5 project managers, and they'll say, well, we can provide 3, but we can only provide them on these days. So they automatically rule themselves out of the bid. So from 7 becomes 3 or 2. You have obviously market sharing, and you also may have, I don't know what the legislation is like in Madagascar, but certainly in some countries you will have particular law and procedures where bids have got to be submitted in a certain format. They have to contain certain information, and if they're badly written, they will be ruled out. They may be the best bidder, but because it's badly written, they will be ruled out. So if a company knows this, it's a simple way of ruling themselves out of the bid. So from 7, we have now gone down, very simply, gone down to 2 or 1 companies that are part of the competitive process. And finally, obviously, bribery, where you have an insider threat as well, makes it much easier for colluding companies to manipulate the contract towards the particular contractor. Again, so I'll just run through these quickly. Again, the same company always wins. Company always loses. Why would you continually bid on work where you continually lose a contract? So if there's a regular pattern of a losing company, do you want to look further at that? Again, shared mistakes in terminology. Losing company works as a subcontractor, particularly where, and I've certainly had it on one occasion where, as another example, where a winning company actually turns down, he's awarded the contract, turns it down, and actually says, in actual fact, we can't do it, but this other company will be able to do it for you. Now, they were ruled out during the tender process because of poor quality of services, but that now they're saying they should be the main contractor. So if they come in as a subcontractor, again, is there, again, it might be an indicator of collusion between the companies. Again, vendor bids too high, adds conditions, or submits a poor bid. Price drop when a new company comes in. So if you have a new company come into the country or is created, again, do they drop the prices? Same contractor as multiple on multiple bids. Again, has there been a mistake? And bidding companies unqualified, so is ruled out at the technical stage. So again, particularly where there is corruption involved, or it may even be a ghost company, has a particular company been invited to give the appearance of competition, where in actual fact it was never going to win because they were never up to scratch, because of maybe capability, they haven't got the financial standing, or for many other reasons. And I think hopefully this is finally, before I run out of time, asset misappropriation. Just looking at the theft of assets. Again, one area where organizations, and many organizations I've seen, don't look at, and they have significant risk. So you can look at patterns within the data, depending on obviously what's available, to look at particular risk. Again, where we look at losses, it's rare that a company or an organization, for that matter, will say that an asset's been stolen. It'll generally be put down as lost. So we will look at patterns, what are the high value, high volume or attractive items that have been lost, or particularly regularly lost. So we will look at high volume. Certainly one, when we broke down a schedule of, I think it was around £5 million worth of losses, one of the regular volume items that were lost were things like traffic cones. And there was two issues there. One, traffic cones wasn't an item that was particularly needed by an organization, so why was it being procured? And secondly, the losses, it's obviously the theft was going to like a haulage company, a company that was involved in infrastructure projects that needed to use it. So it allowed us, certainly, and the losses were lost in transit. So it allowed us to narrow down certainly an investigation. So look, again, look at these. These are three key elements to look at for losses of, particularly procurement. Again, linked to that, again, overstate material requirements to facilitate the theft. Now, is this something that's done within the warehousing department itself, where they identify the losses, or is there someone else within the organisation that's procuring higher than a volume requirement? Because actually, in fact, the thefts are going to particular individuals, or maybe going to a company, and generally speaking, in these cases, where there is significant theft, you may find there is more than one individual involved. Particularly in the warehousing, you may find there is like a delivery driver involved as well that will facilitate the theft and delivery to, whether it's a personal address or to a business address. So things like proactive things like, I suppose, SatNav, could actively look at where the vehicle movements, as an example, to look at where what the routes are and what they should be, are two different things. Again, undelivered items, and this can be quite significant if the system allows it. Where there's been purchase made, is there a goods receipt note being received? Is it being added to the system? And also compare this with, has the invoice been paid? I've certainly seen it in organizations where there's been significant undelivered items. The items haven't been paid, but the items themselves have been into the millions. So it's certainly one to be aware of, because it can be quite common, particularly with this international procurement. Again, transportation losses in transit. Disposal, again, an area that's not, particularly in government, some private sectors degree will look at recovering monies back into the organisation where not even necessarily a high value asset comes to the end of its life. It will look to sell it off to recover some of the monies. Now, where you have a disposal process in place, particularly where there's if there's no policy, the policy isn't being followed, is there an opportunity for significant theft? Particularly there's a high level of write-off, scrap damage, and obsolescence, and there's an automatic, it's sort of sign off as being done, or losses are unknown, so it's just basically written off. Where you have that, you may have significant theft in its various forms, to various vendors, addresses, scrap dealers. There is many methods, and depending on the type of items that have been disposed of, and you may find particularly that high value items, high volume items are written off, and when in actual fact they're brand new, but they're actually being stolen. And again, compare these losses obviously to the procurement route, particularly where the losses are single source procured. Is there, if like organized crime within the organization? So you have, potentially a number of individuals now involved in the identification of the procurement itself. It's going single source, not to bring attention to the procurement, in actual fact, and then we're going again into the process of disposal immediately. And this is where, again, you can look at things like conflict of interest. Are individuals within your organization linked to a particular company? So can we do things like conflicts of interest checks, looking at company formation data, looking at shareholders, etc. Again, low value procurement and high value losses. Again, rentals is not uncommon, particularly if it's not monitored. Again, analysis, a comparison between, again, asset receipt, asset registers, end user receipt, and assess weaknesses in these controls. So it'll give you a level of understanding of what your assets are procured and what you actually have in play and what the level of losses are. To have an overall figure, overall picture, even look at the requisition, purchase order, and the invoice at the start. So your three-way match, and then look at the receipt. Does it go on the register, and does it go to the end user? So you've actually got 6 areas you can look at, just to look at your level of losses, and also within that, who's involved in the process. So it'll give you a level of risk and in individuals that may be involved in a conspiracy. Again, you're from an external threat perspective, you've got your overbilling, incomplete orders, which I've touched on, outside business interests from individuals. Has it been disclosed? So do you check against conflict of interest registers? Again, resale and disposal assets, which is not common. Creation of false records, obviously, to hide the theft. Creation of fictitious requirements, particularly where it's regular, is that something that could be analysed to show mapping. And the 5-way match, in fact, is a 6-way match to look at potential missing data. Again, false receipt of goods, obviously that's a key point, and where let's say it's coming onto the asset register. So is it an area that is actively looked at by, if you like, the warehousing staff, or where the goods are coming into the organization? Again, and I'm not going to touch on today, but obviously the quality of goods as well, because this is a point where product substitution or counterfeit products will come into play as well. So that's quite an important point at the goods receipt. Obviously to check, and that is the end. I think hopefully that's just about an hour. I appreciate there's quite a lot of information there that I touched on, but there was a lot to get into there, and I wanted to give you as much as possible around that. I certainly hope it was worth your while. I'll certainly open it up to any questions if you've got any. Over to you, Herisoa. No one? Any questions?
So I apologize at the beginning. I have a problem of my device. So I can't to introduce you today. But as you are a regular, I think it's not a problem. Thank you for your interesting presentation today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for.
I do apologise for not introducing myself. Actually, that's very rude.
Thank you.
I should have. I made the assumption that everybody knew who I was. Actually, that was really bad of me. Actually, I do apologise. I just went straight into it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your effort, and thank you to help us to stand against fraud. It's very important for us.
My pleasure. And certainly, if you've got any questions after this on everything that I've provided, or there's an area you want to consider around data analysis, or there's a particular area of the procurement or project process that you want to actively target, I will certainly happily discuss ideas of detection techniques that you could consider to look at, certainly.
Mm-hmm. I have a question.
Okay.
If like in Madagascar, if our company haven't data, so if we have not data, what do you have to do?
So it was the one. It's the one challenge you have, really, and it was certainly one that I didn't really mention. If you have only got hard copy data, if you haven't got anything electronic, this makes it very difficult. The only way to get around that is to actively go through every hard copy file and put it onto like an Excel spreadsheet to look at the risk and to do your own data analysis. And I've certainly had to do that before many years ago, where we found an invoice in fraud, and we knew that certainly on a number of invoices, 25% of the invoice was fraudulent. We had to go through 10 years worth of contracts and invoices and every single invoice to look at the fraud. Now, the problem with that is that certainly in the case that I dealt with, there was about 3,000 invoices, if not more, because of the volume of work that this company did. So rather than go for them criminally, we actually went for them through the civil courts, because criminally you have to prove criminality in every single invoice. Whereas in the civil courts, you just have to prove on a balance of probabilities that there was fraud throughout each contract and the level of fraud. And we demonstrated on a number of invoices within each contract that there was fraud, and that the percentage of the fraud was around 25%. So we actually went civilly and recovered the full value of the fraud within the civil recovery. But yeah, difficult. It's difficult to do data analysis. All I can suggest is, again, if there's a high risk type of contract, you look at the contract type. You particularly where, as an example, facilities management. Around facilities management, it's a very for the maintenance of a building or a hospital or a public sector organizations, infrastructure project, whatever, where you have facility in there, and you think even things like security, you could be proactive and dip sample the work that's being done to look for irregularity, and then if there is irregularity, then you can go into a more broader data analysis, where if you've got one or two invoices that are fraudulent, then you can broaden it and then say, right, we're actually going to take all invoices over within the lifetime of that contract, and then take it from there and get legal advice, or certainly you'd want an auditor involved who would want to look at the analysis of that. And there's obviously various forms of analysis, but difficult, very difficult. Sorry.
Okay. Now, how about internet? Can you have a good information to do research in internet?
Isn't it? For me, it's a hugely valuable tool. One of the common things I do is in any supplier. I mean, you can put in the name of like you put in Steve Tosh and then you can put corruption, and you will find something Steve Tosh and corruption because I train in corruption, so something will come up. Same with the company, but I always put in the company name and I put the word and I put comma then scandal, because it's a more common word used by the press. So if there is a scandal, it might not come up with fraud, but actually it might come up with another risk that you would be interested in. Because for me, what I did back in 2016, 7 years ago now, I did a 3-month exercise. I listed all the major companies online from all the different press outlets that had committed fraud and corruption, and there was hundreds. And then and I listed the various methodologies, who was involved, if it had it, the amounts. Then what I did was when I went to Dubai. I remember it's in end of 2016 for 3 years. And one of the first things I did was I looked at these companies, were they in Dubai? And the main companies were all in Dubai. Now, I'm not suggesting that those companies are committing fraud, but if there's a methodology in the open source that they've used, do you want to check that methodology in your contracts? And I'll give you another example. In the UK, when I talked about bid rigging, in the UK, there was 100 companies fined for bid rigging within construction contracts. It was actually in relation to construction work on schools. Now, a lot of these companies, because they all collude together, and they're only fined because there was 5 or more instances of bid rigging that they identified. Five. In actual fact, of all the companies, there was actually 1,000 companies they looked at with at least 1 or more indicators, but they only fined the top 100. But once you've got that public information, what was clear in the report was the method of how they committed the fraud and the bid rigging, which was basically it was the companies that were inflating prices and were not bidding on the work. That was a simple method. So once you understand that, then you can just lay the common methodology over any large contract. Or we have, in particular Madagascar, we have the same companies that will bid on the same work all the time. Now, to me, if I was a company that I'm only going to win at most 1 in 5 bids, if not more, if not less, I want to make sure that I win at least my share. So I'm going to talk to all these companies. So Madagascar for me is certainly a common ground where it could certainly happen, because you've got a limited supplier base, and it's in their interests, particularly even the smaller companies, it's in their interests, and not just on infrastructure, on anything where there's repeat procurement and there's a little bit of competition. To me, it's open to it because you've got a small supplier base. So I would pick any contract or projects that's repeat or regular, and look at the methodology, look at them involved, because if it's regular, you can see whether there's a pattern on which one is, which one's high, which one didn't respond, and just keep it that simple. And then if there's 10, 15 contracts, there's a pattern, who won, who lost, and then you'll have a pattern. But you can also look at things like, well, how much, if you do your own price assessment to see, how much would that have actually cost us? So you may want to get an external professional to look at, for instance, what it should cost, and then what you're actually getting, what the lowest price is, you might find that there's a significant price increase because that's the level of fraud that they've added to it, because they know there's no one else competing because there's a ring of contractors. So it is one, there's a potential lot of work there, but I think, you know, if you're going to look proactively, it's certainly one for me that you could you could identify a ring, and at the very least, you have the potential for recovery, but you've also got the potential to to actually get value for money, because you're not getting value for money on these contracts because they've inflated the price. So at the very least, you'll reduce the price. So I hope that helped a little bit.
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure.
Another question, not for me, but is there anyone who wants to ask a question?
No, again, I'm happy to receive it afterwards. If you've got any, you know, I've left my contact details on the slides. If anybody's got any questions about it, you know, past or current or future proactive activities, I'm certainly happy to guide you on that, because it can be quite complicated. I mean, I've worked in the space for the best part of 30 years now, so I've got a good idea of certainly where to target. So I'm happy to help out.
Okay. If there is no question, thank you very much. Steve, thank you very much again to help us, and thank you very much for our time, for our efforts to help us to stand against fraud. You are a regular here. You are a regular here, and your presentation are always very, very interesting.
Thank you.
So if there is a question, can you send it by mail or so?
Email's fine. I don't know if they want to send them directly or send them to you, Harry. So I'm happy with either. If you want to send a list through, I'm happy to provide a response. Either I can put an email together or do a quick sort of video response covering all the areas. I'll certainly happily do that.
Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Okay, thank you. And have a great evening. Much appreciated.
Yes, good evening for you too.